March 1, 1953. A lone man lies, stricken and partially paralyzed, on the floor of his silent country house. For long, terrible hours, no one dares enter. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union is dying, effectively abandoned by his own guards, terrified of his wrath even as he takes his final breaths. How did this happen? How did the boy named Ioseb, So-So, from a tiny, sun-drenched Georgian village, become a tyrant so absolute, so feared, that his own servants would rather let him die than risk his displeasure? What alchemy of trauma, ideology, and ruthless ambition forged the man of steel? This is the story of that transformation. From the devout seminarian who discovered revolution, to the outlaw Koba, robbing banks for the cause, to the political schemer who outmaneuvered every rival in the Kremlin's shadow war. We will witness an industrial revolution built on bones, the paranoid terror that consumed a generation, the stunning pact with Hitler, and the titanic war that cemented his power. We will trace the making of a monster, and the unmaking of a nation. This is Man of Steel, Heart of Stone. A journey into the life of Joseph Stalin. To understand the brutal architecture of the 20th century, you must first understand the man who helped design its darkest hours. Chapter 1, So-So and the Cobbler, 1878–1899. Gori. A town of sun-baked brick, ancient dust, and the heavy scent of fermented grapes. In the winter, the winds howl down from the Caucasus Mountains, but in the late autumn of 1878, the chill is already in the air. Here, in a one-room hut with a dirt floor, a child is born. They call him Ioseb. His mother, Kiki, calls him So-So, a name of tenderness, of soft light. But the world he enters is anything but tender. To understand the man who would one day command the fate of half the globe, you must first look at the small, scarred boy in the shadow of the Georgian hills. So-So was the only one of 3 children to survive infancy. To his mother, a deeply pious laundress, he was a miracle, a gift from God to be polished until he shone like a golden icon. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled and took in the washing of the wealthy, all for one singular purpose: So-So would not be a laborer. He would be a priest. He would stand at the altar, draped in the incense of the Orthodox Church and an authority far greater than any cobbler could imagine. But there was another force in that small hut. Bessarion, the cobbler. Bessarion was a man of leather and rage. A skilled craftsman whose hands were increasingly occupied by the bottle rather than the boot. When the wine took hold, the house became a theater of terror. So-So watched as his father's violence fell upon his mother like a sudden summer storm. Then, the storm would turn on him. Think of those 2 inheritances. From his mother, So-So learned a ferocious, narrow-eyed will, the belief that one must endure any hardship to achieve a higher station. From his father, he learned the most foundational lesson of his life, that power is not granted by love or law, but expressed through fear and the administration of pain. By the age of 7, the world began to leave its permanent marks on him. Smallpox ravaged the town, and it did not spare So-So. He survived, but his face was left pitted and scarred, a pockmarked boy who would spend the rest of his life having his official portraits retouched to hide the damage. Not long after, a carriage accident left his left arm slightly shorter, slightly stiffer. He was marked by his environment, forged in a crucible of physical frailty and domestic war. Then came the silence. After years of chaos, Bessarion simply walked away. He left for the city of Tiflis, abandoning his family. For So-So, this wasn't just a relief, it was a lesson in desertion. The father figures in his life were either violent or absent. Only the steel-willed Kiki remained, pushing him toward the church school in Gori, and eventually, the grand prize, the Tiflis Theological Seminary. The Tiflis Seminary was a fortress of stone and dogma, run by monk students called the Black Mobs. So-So mastered the art of the double life. Outwardly, he was the brilliant student with the angelic singing voice. In secret, he devoured forbidden books passed hand to hand like contraband. And then he found Karl Marx. This wasn't study, it was a conversion. The Bible's distant heaven was replaced by Marx's scientific promise of an earthly revolution. The anger once reserved for a drunken cobbler now had a vast new target: the Tsar, the Church, the entire imperial order. By 1899, the mask was gone. His rebellion turned overt. He skipped exams, organized protests, and became a liability. In May of that year, the seminary expelled him. Officially, for failure to attend examinations. In reality, they were casting out a rebel. As the gates of the seminary slammed shut behind him, the 20-year-old Soso stood at a crossroads. He had no money, no home, and no future in the church his mother had sacrificed everything for. The devout Soso was dead. The obedient son was gone. What remained was a hardened intellect, a deep well of resentment, a talent for secrecy, and a newfound faith in violent, total change. The seminary had expelled the student. But it had created something far more dangerous, a revolutionary with nothing left to lose, and a world to gain. He would need a new name. In the underground, they would soon know him as Koba.
This journey into history is brought to you by Ecolib. If you are captivated by this story of power, ambition, and the making of a dictator, then don't miss a single chapter. Subscribe to the Ecolib channel now. Hit the like button to help others discover this in-depth biography. And if you know someone fascinated by history's most formidable figures, please share this audiobook with them. Your support through subscribing is what allows us to dedicate the time and research to bring you these comprehensive narratives. It means everything. Thank you for listening. Now, the story continues.
Chapter 2, Koba, the Revolutionary Outlaw, 1899 to 1917. Tiflis at the turn of the century was a city of two faces. Above, the Russian governors and Georgian aristocrats moved through grand boulevards and opera houses. But below, in the labyrinthine alleys of the Armenian Quarter and the reeking tanneries of the riverbank, a different world was breathing. This was the world Ioseb Jugashvili entered after the seminary gates closed. He was 20 years old, penniless, and marked by the secret police. By day, he maintained a thin veneer of respectability, working as a lowly clerk at the Tiflis Geophysical Observatory. He sat among barometers and wind gauges, recording the weather. But his mind was not on the clouds, it was on the coming storm. At night, the clerk vanished. In damp cellars and backroom taverns, he became a ghost in the machine of revolution. He didn't stand on crates to give soaring speeches like the intellectuals from the university. Instead, he worked. His fingers were perpetually stained with the oily black ink of secret printing presses. He moved through the shadows of the railway workshops, organizing strikes and whispering the gospel of Marx to men who understood only sweat and hunger. He was learning the logistics of conspiracy, how to hide a press, how to forge a passport, how to smell an informant before they spoke. It was during these years that the boy, Soso, finally died, and a new identity was forged, Koba. He took the name from a popular Georgian novel, The Patricide. In the story, Koba is a vengeful bandit, a man of the mountains who lives by his own law and wages a private war against an unjust system. By choosing this name, he was sending a message. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a predator. He was the man who did what was necessary while the fancy talkers. Men like Leon Trotsky, who debated theory in the safety of London and Paris, spent their lives in coffee houses. Koba grew to despise them. To him, they were peacocks of the revolution. He was its teeth. But the life of a revolutionary is a cycle of action and consequence. Between 1902 and his final exile in 1913, Koba would be arrested, imprisoned, and exiled repeatedly to the frozen wasteland of Siberia. Think of the Stolipin cars. The windowless, iron-bound prison trains that rattled for weeks across the steppe. Think of the silence of a Siberian hut, where the mercury freezes in the thermometer and the wind screams against the timber. Most men broke in the exile. They went mad, they drank themselves to death, or they simply withered. Koba did not wither. He escaped. Time and again, through the snow and the wolf-haunted forests, he found his way back to the fight. This was his graduate education. The prisons were his classrooms, filled with the hardened elite of the Bolshevik movement. Here, his reputation grew. He was the one who could survive anything. He was the one who never talked to the guards. He was the one who was unbreakable. Around 1913, a new name began to appear in a key article he wrote for the party press. A name that reflected this hardened, industrial spirit. He was no longer just the mountain bandit. He was Stalin. The man of steel. If anyone doubted his resolve, the morning of June 26, 1907, provided a bloody answer. Yerevan Square in Tiflis was crowded with merchants and peasants when a heavily armed government stagecoach, carrying a fortune in state funds, entered the plaza. Stalin did not pull the trigger that day, he was the architect in the shadows. His childhood friend, a near-mythical psychopath named Kamo, led the assault. The world exploded in a hail of handmade grenades and Mauser fire. Horses screamed as they were torn apart by shrapnel. Bystanders were mowed down in the crossfire. When the smoke cleared, some 40 people lay dead or dying on the cobblestones. The Bolsheviks vanished into the alleys with 340,000 rubles, millions in today's money. The Tiflis expropriation sent shockwaves through the European socialist movement. Many high-minded Marxists were horrified by the carnage, calling it the work of common gangsters. Stalin didn't care. He saw the world with a cold and moral pragmatism. The revolution needed money. Money required violence. Therefore, violence was a revolutionary duty. The heart of stone was no longer a metaphor, it was his operating system. By the eve of 1917, 18 years of underground warfare had completed the transformation. The pockmarked boy from Gori was gone. In his place stood a master of clandestine organization, a man devoid of sentiment, a man who viewed human beings as either tools or obstacles. He was now a central, if shadowy, figure in the Bolshevik Party. Vladimir Lenin, the movement's leader, valued him precisely because he was the miraculous Georgian, the man who could get his hands dirty so the theorists could keep theirs clean. Stalin was a forged instrument, tempered in the frost of Siberia and the blood of Yerevan Square. As the First World War ground the Russian Empire into dust and the Romanov throne began to wobble, the man of steel was waiting in the wings. He was finished with the shadows. He was ready for the light of a burning world. In 1917, the empire would crumble. And Joseph Stalin, tempered in prison and shadow, was ready to step out of the darkness and into the chaos of a world remade. Chapter 3, The Grey Blur, 1917 to 1924. 1917, the year the world tilted on its axis. In Petrograd, the air smelled of wood smoke, cheap tobacco, and the electric charge of impending collapse. The Romanov dynasty, 3 centuries of absolute rule, vanished in a week of bread riots and mutinies. By October, the Bolsheviks had seized the Winter Palace, and the names of Lenin and Trotsky were on every tongue in Europe. But there was another man on the stage. He did not give the soaring orations that shook the rafters of the Smolny Institute. He did not command the Red Guard from the back of an armored car. While Leon Trotsky electrified the masses with his brilliance, Joseph Stalin moved through the corridors like a ghost. One keen observer, the memoirist Nikolai Sukhanov, would later describe him as nothing more than a grey blur, a man who was always present, always working, but who left no distinct impression. It was a fatal miscalculation. While the firebrands were busy making history, the grey blur was busy making the machine that would eventually consume them all. Stalin was Lenin's blunt instrument, the man willing to handle the gritty, unglamorous labor of administration and the dirty work of the new state. As the revolution gave way to a horrific civil war, Stalin was sent to the front. In 1918, he arrived in the vital southern city of Tsaritsyn. A dusty, starving fortress that served as the gateway to the grain of the Caucasus. Here, the man of steel truly found his method. To Stalin, the war was not just about defeating the White armies, it was about absolute control. He didn't trust the former Tsarist officers Trotsky had recruited to lead the Red Army. He saw them as class enemies and potential traitors. Ignoring orders from Moscow, Stalin launched a purge of the military command. He arrested and purged the military command. Executions were frequent, with grim reports of officers shot on barges that were then sunk in the Volga. He militarized the railroads and seized food from the peasantry at gunpoint. In Tsaritsyn, he formed a core group of loyalists, men like the brutal cavalryman Kliment Voroshilov, who realized that under Stalin, results mattered more than rules. He learned that in the chaos of a collapsing world, a heart of stone was an asset, and fear was the ultimate glue of loyalty. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had won the war, but they had inherited a graveyard. As the party transitioned from a revolutionary movement to a governing body, its structure became bloated and complex. In April 1922, Stalin was appointed to a newly created, seemingly dry post, General Secretary of the Communist Party. His rivals, the brilliant theorist Trotsky, the smooth orator Zinoviev, the intellectual Kamenev, saw it as a clerical dead end. They were interested in world revolution and high philosophy. They left the boring work of moving papers, organizing meetings, and recording minutes to Stalin. They didn't realize they had just handed him the keys to the kingdom. Stalin understood something his rivals did not: in a one-party state, personnel is power. Every mid-level promotion, every regional appointment, every transfer of a provincial official now crossed his desk. With the patience of a spider, he began to fill the party's vast bureaucracy with his own people. If a man in Siberia wanted a better apartment or a post in Moscow, he learned that it was Stalin who held the pen. He was weaving a web of patronage that stretched from the Kremlin to the furthest corners of the Soviet Union. He was no longer just a leader, he was the apparatus. However, one man saw the danger. Vladimir Lenin, the father of the revolution, began to suffer a series of debilitating strokes in late 1922. As his health failed, his eyes were opened to the monster he had helped create. He was particularly enraged by the Georgian affair, where Stalin had used physical violence to crush the independence of Georgian communists. From his sickbed, Lenin dictated a final, explosive document, his political testament. It was a critique of his potential successors, and his assessment of Stalin was chillingly clear. Comrade Stalin, Lenin wrote, having become General Secretary, has concentrated immense power in his hands, and I am not sure he will always know how to use that power with sufficient caution. In a final postscript, he was even more direct: Stalin is too rude, therefore, I propose to the comrades to find a way to remove Stalin from that post. It was a death warrant for Stalin's career. But Lenin's voice was failing. Stalin, acting as part of the inner circle managing the dying leader's isolation, worked to control access and information. He monitored Lenin's doctors, screened his mail, and worked feverishly behind the scenes to discredit the testament. When Lenin finally died on January 21, 1924, Stalin moved with lightning speed. He positioned himself as the chief mourner. He ignored Lenin's own wishes for a simple burial and instead had the body embalmed and placed in a massive mausoleum, turning the dead leader into a god and himself into the high priest. The testament was suppressed, read only to a select few and then buried. The warning was silenced. By the end of 1924, the grey blur had emerged from the shadows. The fiery orators and brilliant theorists still dominated the headlines and the public squares. But Joseph Stalin had something more substantial. He had the filing cabinets. He had the address books. He had the dossiers. And most importantly, he had thousands of men across the empire who owed him their lives. The man of steel had built his fortress not of stone, but of paper and debt. The board was set. The shadow war for the Throne of Scorpions was about to begin. Chapter 4, The Throne of Scorpions, 1924 to 1929. When Vladimir Lenin died in January 1924, he left behind a revolution, a new empire, and a vacuum. The leadership of the Soviet Union was not a seat of honor, it was a cage of scorpions. At the top sat the Politburo, 5 men, each believing himself the true heir to the Bolshevik throne. There was Leon Trotsky, the brilliant, arrogant architect of the Red Army. There were Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, the old Bolsheviks, who controlled the powerful party machines in Leningrad and Moscow. There was Nikolai Bukharin, the golden boy of the party and its leading intellectual. And then, there was the General Secretary. Stalin's rivals viewed him as a useful mediocrity. To them, he was still the grey blur, the man who took the minutes and managed the personnel files. They were world-class orators and theorists who spent their days debating the fine points of Marxist theology. Stalin, however, had spent the last 2 years building a fortress out of those filing cabinets. While they were winning arguments in the press, he was winning the people who counted, the thousands of provincial secretaries and delegates who owed their jobs to him. The game began with a masterstroke of isolation. Stalin knew that Trotsky was the greatest threat. A man of immense charisma and military power. To destroy him, Stalin formed an unholy alliance with Zinoviev and Kamenev, known as the Triumvirate. The weapon they used was not a gun, but a word, Leninism. Stalin positioned himself as the humble, tireless defender of Lenin's orthodox legacy. He seized upon and championed the doctrine of socialism in one country, the idea that the Soviet Union could build a socialist paradise alone, without waiting for a world revolution. It was simple, patriotic, and grounded. He then painted Trotsky's theory of a permanent revolution as a dangerous, anti-Leninist gamble that would lead the nation to ruin. Using his control of the party apparatus, Stalin ensured that Trotsky was shouted down at every meeting. His supporters were transferred to remote posts, his past disagreements with Lenin were magnified and distorted in the state-run newspapers. By 1925, the brilliant Trotsky, the man who had once stood second only to Lenin, was stripped of his military command. The orator had been silenced by the bureaucrat. But in the cage of scorpions, an alliance is merely a preparation for betrayal. With Trotsky sidelined, the triumvirate was no longer useful to Stalin. He pivoted instantly to the right of the party, joining with Nikolai Bukharin. Bukharin supported the new economic policy, a moderate path that allowed for a degree of capitalism to rebuild the war-torn country. Stalin used this to attack his former allies, Zinoviev and Kamenev, branding them as left-wing extremists who would alienate the peasantry. At the 14th Party Congress in 1925, Zinoviev and Kamenev finally realized the trap. They tried to speak against Stalin, but the hall was packed with delegates handpicked by Stalin's secretariat. They were hissed, booed, and outvoted. They had helped Stalin build the machine that was now crushing them. Within 2 years, they, along with Trotsky, were expelled from the party. The left was dead. Now, only the right remained. By 1928, Stalin was the dominant force in the Kremlin. He no longer needed Bukharin or the moderate new economic policy. In a final, cynical pivot, Stalin adopted the very radicalism he had just destroyed the left for. He called for a great break. The forced, rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union and the violent seizure of peasant lands. When Bukharin protested, Stalin turned the machine on him. The man once called the darling of the party was branded a right-wing deviationist and a protector of the rich peasants. He was marginalized, mocked, and eventually broken. By early 1929, Trotsky was forced into exile abroad, a man without a home. Zinoviev and Kamenev were reduced to pathetic figures, forced to publicly confess their errors to stay alive. The throne was no longer vacant. The scorpions had been cleared away, leaving only one man. The world saw the result on December 21, 1929. It was Joseph Stalin's 50th birthday, and it was transformed into a national epiphany. For weeks, the newspapers were filled with nothing but fawning poems, tributes, and telegrams from across the globe. Pravda declared him the great architect of socialism and Lenin's best pupil. Factories were renamed in his honor. Mountains were christened with his name. This was the birth of the cult of personality. The grey blur was gone, erased from history. In his place stood the Vozd, the leader. This was not a celebration of a man, but the coronation of an idol. Stalin had merged his identity with the state itself. To disagree with Stalin was no longer a political difference. It was an act of treason against the Soviet Union. As the fireworks faded over the Kremlin, the atmosphere in Russia changed. The internal party wars were over, but a much larger war was about to begin. Stalin had secured the throne of scorpions. Now, he turned his gaze outward, toward the millions of peasants, workers, and enemies of the state. The man of steel had found his power. Now, the nation would feel the weight of his hand. Chapter 5, The Great Transformation, 1929 to 1934. By 1929, the internal chess game in the Kremlin was over. Joseph Stalin was no longer merely the first among equals, he was the master of the Soviet universe. But for Stalin, power was not a prize to be enjoyed, it was a hammer to be swung. Looking out from the Kremlin, he saw a nation he considered dangerously backward, a peasant empire historically beaten, as he saw it, by Mongol Khans and feudal lords. "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries," he declared. "We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or we shall be crushed." This was the birth of the first 5-year plan, a revolution from above that was, in reality, a declaration of total war against Russia's past. Stalin's goal was a forced march into the industrial age. He envisioned a landscape of smoke and iron, of massive steel mills like Magnitogorsk rising from the Siberian steppe, and great hydroelectric dams taming the wild rivers. It was a fevered dream of modernization, fueled by fanatical propaganda and impossible quotas. Laborers were called shock workers and soldiers of the rear. The language of the factory became the language of the front line. But the machinery of the city required the blood of the countryside. To pay for the foreign technology and the heavy equipment, Stalin needed grain, vast quantities of it, to export for hard currency. And he needed to control the hands that grew it. The target was the kulak, the supposedly wealthy peasant, though in many villages, a kulak was simply any man who owned 2 cows instead of 1. By the end of 1929, Stalin had issued the order that would shatter the ancient rhythms of rural life, the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. The state descended upon the villages like an invading army. 25,000 fanatical party urbanites, backed by GPU secret police and Red Army bayonets, arrived to force the peasants into collective farms, the kolkhozes. It was a scene from the apocalypse. Doors were axed down in the middle of the night. Families were dragged from their homes and loaded into unheated cattle cars, destined for the frozen wastes of Siberia or the deserts of Kazakhstan. The peasants did not go quietly. They fought back with the only weapon they had, their livestock. Rather than surrender their animals to the state, millions of peasants slaughtered their horses, cattle, and pigs. The stench of rotting meat hung over the countryside as a monument to their defiance. But Stalin's will was a grinding stone. By the time the dust settled, the independent peasantry of Russia had been broken, replaced by a system of state-run agricultural factories. Then, the harvest of sorrow began. In 1932, the inevitable happened. Disrupted by the chaos of collectivization and the slaughter of draft animals, and squeezed by the state's demand for ever higher grain quotas, the food supply collapsed. Famine began to ripple across the USSR, but its epicenter was the breadbasket of the empire, Ukraine. History knows it as the Holodomor, the death by hunger. This was not a natural disaster, it was a political execution. As the grain failed, Stalin did not relent. He increased the quotas. He passed the infamous Law of Spikelets, which decreed that any starving peasant caught stealing a few ears of grain from a collective field could be shot. The borders of Ukraine were sealed by internal passports. Foreign aid was rejected. The famine was denied. In the winter of 1932, a new sound began to haunt the Soviet Union: silence. In the villages of Ukraine and the North Caucasus, the dogs had all been eaten. The cats were gone. Then the birds vanished. People moved through the streets like gray shadows, their bellies swollen, their eyes vacant. Mothers sat on dirt floors, watching their children wither into skeletons. In some districts, the horror reached such depths that the state was forced to put up posters reminding the starving that to eat your own children is a barbarian act. Stalin sat in the Kremlin and reviewed the charts. He saw the reports of cannibalism and mass death, but he did not waver. To him, the famine was a useful tool to break the nationalist spirit of the Ukrainians and the resistance of the peasantry once and for all. While millions died in the dust, the Soviet Union continued to export millions of tons of grain to the West, buying the turbines and the drills for the Great Transformation. By 1934, the balance sheet was written in iron and blood. On the surface, the success was staggering. Steel production had tripled. Coal output had soared. The Dnieper Dam stood as a monument to Bolshevik engineering. Stalin had achieved in 5 years what other nations took 50 to build. But the foundation of this new world was a mass grave. Between 5 and 7 million people had perished in the famine. Hundreds of thousands more had died in the gulags or on the deportation trains. The man of steel had forged his empire, but he had tempered it in the blood of those he claimed to lead. He had proven that his heart was indeed stone. That no amount of human suffering could move him from his path. The nation was traumatized, exhausted, and silent. But for Joseph Stalin, the work was only beginning. He had conquered the economy. He had conquered the peasantry. Now, he turned his cold, yellow eyes toward the only group left that could still dream of defying him, the party itself. The Great Transformation was complete. The Great Terror was about to begin. Chapter 6, The Great Terror, 1934 to 1939. December 1, 1934. Leningrad. The corridors of the Smolny Institute are usually alive with the hum of Soviet bureaucracy, but today, they are pierced by the sharp crack of a revolver. Sergei Kirov, the charismatic, popular leader of the Leningrad Party and a man many whispered could be a successor to Stalin, falls dead outside his office. The assassin is Leonid Nikolaev, a disgruntled lone gunman. But the scene is too perfect. Nikolaev had been detained by the NKVD twice before with a weapon and released. On the day of the murder, Kirov's bodyguard was mysteriously absent, and when the guard was later summoned for questioning, he died in a traffic accident while in a police truck. While a lone gunman was the official story, the suspicious circumstances have led many historians to conclude Stalin almost certainly orchestrated it to eliminate a rival and create a pretext for terror. What is certain is that within hours of the shooting, Stalin signed a decree that stripped all accused terrorists of the right to a defense or appeal. The law was a trapdoor, and beneath it lay an abyss. Kirov's death was the starter's pistol for the Great Terror. Stalin did not merely want to kill his rivals, he wanted to destroy their souls. To do this, he transformed the Soviet courtroom into a grotesque theater, the Moscow show trials. Between 1936 and 1938, the giants of the revolution, men like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, were dragged into the light. These old Bolsheviks, who had faced the Tsar's hangman without flinching, now stood before the world and confessed to impossible crimes. They admitted to being spies for Nazi Germany, to plotting with the exiled Trotsky, and to attempting to poison the nation's food supply. The world watched in bewilderment. Why would they confess? The answer lay in the basement of the Lubyanka prison. Through the conveyor system of sleep deprivation, relentless beatings, and the threat to execute their wives and children, the NKVD broke them. Prosecutor Andrei Vyshinsky, his face contorted with state-sanctioned rage, shouted at the defendants, calling them mad dogs of capitalism and scum of the earth. The scripts were written by Stalin himself, sometimes corrected in his own red pencil. When the performances ended, the result was always a bullet in the back of the head. But the terror was not reserved for the elite. It was an infection that spread to every factory, every apartment block, and every village. The engine of this repression was the Gulag, the main directorate of correctional labor camps. By the late 1930s, the camp population swelled to 1.5 million souls. Over the entire Stalin era, historians estimate up to 18 million people passed through this shadow empire. The Gulag was a world of white coal, human beings used as fuel for the state's industrial hunger. In the frozen hell of Kolyma and the mines of Norilsk, prisoners worked with primitive tools in temperatures 40 degrees below zero. They died of scurvy, exhaustion, and the casual cruelty of guards. The victims were not terrorists. They were intellectuals who read the wrong book, peasants who took a handful of grain, or simply the neighbor of a man who had already been arrested. The midnight knock on the door became the defining sound of a generation. As the decade waned, Stalin's paranoia turned toward his own shield, the Red Army. In 1937, he struck at the high command, accusing Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, a brilliant military mind, of a pro-Nazi conspiracy based on forged documents. Tukhachevsky's confession, preserved in the archives, is splattered with his own blood, a silent witness to the methods of his interrogation. The purge of the military was a decapitation. 13 of 15 army commanders were executed. 50 of 57 corps commanders vanished. In his drive to eliminate any conceivable threat, Stalin had critically weakened the very institution tasked with the nation's defense. The terror even devoured the men who carried it out. Genrik Yagoda, the head of the NKVD who oversaw the first purges, was arrested and shot. His successor, the bloody dwarf Nikolai Yezhov, followed him to the execution cellar soon after. Stalin wiped the blood from his hands by killing his executioners, making them the scapegoats for the excesses of the era. By 1939, the Great Terror began to subside, not out of mercy, but because it had run out of victims. Let us put the human cost into perspective. According to official Soviet archives, in just the two peak years of 1937 and 1938, 681,692 people were executed by the state, an average of nearly 1,000 judicial murders every single day. On top of that, at least 160,000 more perished from starvation and disease within the Gulag camps during that period. In total, approximately 1.5 million people were arrested. No institution was spared. The Red Army's leadership was gutted, with a staggering 80% of its highest-ranking commanders purged, executed, or imprisoned. The Soviet Union now stood silent and broken, purged of its past and its potential. The man of steel ruled a kingdom of ghosts, where loyalty was measured only by the depth of one's fear. He was the undisputed master of a hollowed nation. But across the western border, a new and terrible storm was gathering. Adolf Hitler watched the chaos in the Kremlin with a predatory grin. Stalin had secured his throne with blood and iron, but in doing so, he had left the gates of his empire dangerously unguarded. Chapter 7, The Devil's Pact, 1939 to 1941. The Kremlin, August 23, 1939. The air in Moscow is thick, not just with the late summer heat, but with the suffocating weight of a geopolitical earthquake. For a decade, the world had been defined by a binary struggle, the Red Star versus the swastika. They were the ultimate ideological predators, destined to devour one another. But tonight, the predators are sharing a meal. In a brilliantly lit hall, Vyacheslav Molotov, Stalin's iron-arse diplomat, sits beside Joachim von Ribbentrop, the champagne salesman turned Nazi foreign minister. Behind them stands Joseph Stalin. He is beaming, his eyes crinkled in a rare, genuine-looking smile. He raises a glass of Crimean wine to the health of the Führer. The public world is paralyzed by the announcement of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact. It is the ultimate cynical pivot. But the true darkness lies in the pact's annex, the infamous secret protocol. A document that treats Eastern Europe like a carcass on a butcher's block. With a few strokes of a pen, Stalin and Hitler draw a line through Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. Stalin believes he has won the ultimate game of poker. By shaking hands with the devil, he has stayed Hitler's hand, diverted the Nazi war machine toward the west, and reclaimed the lost frontiers of the Tsars. In September, the Red Army rolls into eastern Poland to meet the Wehrmacht in a grotesque parade of victors. Stalin is at the peak of his power, a master of the realpolitik chessboard, convinced he has outmaneuvered everyone. The deaf ear. But Stalin's triumph is built on a foundation of sand. As 1940 turns to 1941, the honeymoon of the dictators begins to sour. Stalin's vast intelligence network, perhaps the most sophisticated in human history, begins to hum with a singular, terrifying frequency. The signals are everywhere. From the Lucy Ring in Switzerland to the legendary Richard Sorge in Tokyo, the messages are precise. Sorge's dispatch is a scream in the dark: the German invasion will begin on June 22. 150 divisions are massing at the border. The warnings were relentless. Just weeks before, a German communist working as a Soviet courier in Berlin delivered the exact German battle order. Stalin scrawled across it, "This agent is a liar." Stalin reads these reports in the silence of his office. He marks them with a blue pencil. He calls them English provocation. Why did the most paranoid man in history suddenly become so trusting? It was a catastrophic cocktail of arrogance and ideology. Stalin believed Hitler was a rational actor, a fellow realist who would never risk a two-front war. He was convinced he could control the timeline, that war was a distant 1942 problem. To Stalin, the intelligence warnings were noise, a British plot by Winston Churchill to lure the Soviet Union into a war for London's benefit. He orders his generals to stay quiet. He forbids reconnaissance flights. He refuses to authorize defensive positions, fearing that a single nervous Soviet soldier might provide Hitler with a pretext for war. He is clinging to the pact like a man holding a lightning rod in a thunderstorm, convinced that if he just stands still, the bolt will never strike. The night the world broke. June 22, 1941. 3:15 a.m. The silence of the frontier is vaporized. The roar of 3 million Axis troops is preceded by a horizon of fire. It is the largest invasion in the history of warfare. Luftwaffe bombers scream across the border, catching the Soviet Air Force on the tarmac. Thousands of planes are turned into charred skeletons before they can even start their engines. The Stalin line is not a wall, but a sieve. Panicked radio operators broadcast in the clear, "We are being fired upon. What shall we do?" The response from Moscow is a terrifying, paralyzed silence. At the Kremlin, the man of steel is nowhere to be found. He is at his dacha, caught in a psychological vacuum. When Marshal Georgy Zhukov finally reaches him by phone to report the carnage, there is no roar of defiance. There is only the sound of heavy breathing. Stalin's world has not just been invaded, it has been invalidated. Everything he believed about his own cunning, his grasp of Hitler, and his control over history has evaporated. He retreats into a profound, dark breakdown. For days, the leader of the Soviet Union disappears. He reportedly mutters to his inner circle: "Lenin left us a great state, and we, his heirs, have fucked it all up." He retires to his country house, convinced the end has come. The vacuum he leaves is filled by the screams of dying soldiers and the sight of entire armies being encircled and devoured by the German blitzkrieg. In those first weeks, millions of Soviet men are marched into captivity. The hubris of one man has become the death warrant for a generation. The Reckoning. After days of paralyzed silence, a small group of Politburo members, Molotov, Beria, and Khrushchev, drive to Stalin's dacha. They are terrified. As they enter, they see Stalin slumped in a chair, haggard and pale. He looks at them with hollow eyes. He genuinely believes they have come to arrest him for his failure. But the heart of stone does not break, it simply hardens in a new shape. Realizing they still need him, or perhaps too afraid to replace him, the ministers ask him to lead the new State Defense Committee. Stalin realizes the game has changed. The poker player is gone, the survivalist remains. On July 3, he finally addresses the Soviet people over the radio. His voice is halting, the clink of a water glass audible against his teeth. He does not use the cold, bureaucratic language of the party. He begins, "Brothers and sisters, my friends. I speak to you, my dear friends." It is a masterful performance of vulnerability from a man who had spent the last decade purging his own people. The man of steel had cracked under the weight of his own errors, but in the fires of June 1941, he reforges himself. The pact with the devil had bought Stalin 2 years of false security and a few hundred miles of territory. In exchange, it had cost him his army, his air force, and nearly his empire. The war he had tried so hard to manipulate had finally arrived. And it would be fought entirely on Hitler's terms. Chapter 8, The Generalissimo, 1941–1945. The man who addressed the Soviet people on July 3, 1941, was a shaken leader, but the man who emerged from the ruins of that summer was something far more formidable. The man of steel did not find redemption in the invasion, he found a new, more terrible clarity. He realized that the survival of the Soviet Union, and his own life, depended on a total, ruthless integration of party and military. He declared himself supreme commander. In the eyes of Joseph Stalin, the war was no longer about ideology or pacts. It was about the cold, mathematical application of force and the absolute expenditure of human life. By July 1942, the German Wehrmacht was slicing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial heart of the Volga. The Red Army was reeling, bleeding, and, in some places, breaking. Stalin's response was not a call for tactical retreat, but a scream of iron will. He issued Order No. 227. Its title became the heartbeat of the Soviet war effort, not a step back. Ni Shaga Nazad. The logic was as brutal as the purges of the 1930s. Panic-mongers and cowards, Stalin decreed, were to be liquidated on the spot. He mandated the creation of blocking detachments, Zagradotriadi, units stationed behind their own lines with machine guns, ordered to fire on any Soviet soldier who retreated without authorization. He formed penal battalions, Strafbats, filled with disgraced officers and criminals, who were sent on near-suicidal missions to clear minefields or spearhead attacks to redeem themselves with blood. To Stalin, the individual was a replaceable gear in a massive, blood-lubricated machine. The nation would be saved not just by courage, but by a terror more immediate than the German guns. The crucible, Stalingrad. The grim foundation of Order 227 was tested in a city that bore his own name, Stalingrad. By late 1942, the conflict had narrowed into a visceral, personal duel between two dictators. For Hitler, the city was a psychological trophy; for Stalin, its loss was an existential impossibility. "There is no land beyond the Volga," the Soviet defenders whispered. Under General Vasily Chukov, the Red Army turned the city into a hellish landscape of rat warfare. Every charred factory, every cellar, and every pile of brick was contested in a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. Soldiers fought floor by floor, a kitchen might be held by the Germans while the hallway remained Soviet. The air was a permanent shroud of dust, oil smoke, and the stench of unburied dead. But while the world's eyes were fixed on the agony of the rubble, Stalin, guided by the plans of his most capable generals, men like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, whom he had finally learned to trust out of sheer necessity, was looking at a map. He approved their audacious plan and ruthlessly marshaled the reserves to make it possible. While the German Sixth Army exhausted itself in the city, Stalin massed a secret million-man force on the flanks. In November 1942, he launched Operation Uranus. In a rapid, synchronized pincer movement, the Soviet tanks cut through the weaker Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the German rear. In just 4 days, the pincers snapped shut. 250,000 Axis troops were trapped in a frozen pocket. When the German surrender finally came in February 1943, the myth of Nazi invincibility lay shattered in the snow. Stalin had won the battle for his namesake, and the tide of the Second World War had irrevocably turned. The defender of 1941 was gone, the inevitable victor had arrived. The diplomat with eyes of ice. As the Red Army began its long, thunderous march toward Berlin, the theater of war expanded to the conference room. At Tehran in 1943 and Yalta in 1945, Stalin sat opposite Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was the Uncle Joe of Western propaganda, but at the table, he was a predator. Stalin was consistently the best-informed man in the room. His intelligence network, spearheaded by the Cambridge Five in the heart of the British establishment, funneled him the Allies' private deliberations. This meant he often knew their bottom lines and internal disputes before negotiations began, allowing him to manipulate and divide them with pinpoint accuracy. He used this advantage with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. Churchill would later remark on Stalin's eyes of ice. He was a master of the long game. He ruthlessly demanded a second front to bleed the Western Allies while his own men bore the brunt of the fighting. He played on Roosevelt's desire for a new world order and Churchill's fears of a bankrupt empire. At Yalta, as a dying Roosevelt looked on, Stalin secured what he truly craved: buffer zone of Soviet-dominated states in Eastern Europe. He didn't just want peace, he wanted a post-war empire. He secured the borders of Poland and the fate of the Balkans not through tanks alone, but through a cold, disarming charm that masked an absolute refusal to compromise on Soviet security. The victor. In April 1945, the Red Army reached the gates of Berlin. The cost of the final assault was staggering, over 300,000 Soviet casualties for the capital alone, but for Stalin, the price was irrelevant. After brutal close-quarters fighting, the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag on the night of April 30th. The war's most iconic photograph was staged days later, on May 2nd, as the city fell. The war in Europe was over. The Man of Steel was now the Generalissimo of the Soviet Union, a title of imperial grandeur that reflected his new status as a global titan. He stood at the apex of power, his image burnished as the savior of the motherland. The catastrophes of 1941, the starvation of the 1930s, and the blood of his own purges were momentarily drowned out by the roar of the victory parades. But the victory was hollowed by a terrifying math: 27 million Soviet dead. The nation was a graveyard of ruined cities and shattered families. Stalin, however, did not look back at the cost. As he stood atop the Lenin Mausoleum, watching the captured Nazi banners being dragged through the dirt of Red Square, his gaze was already shifting. The eyes of ice turned toward the west, across a divided continent. The Generalissimo knew that one war had ended, but his struggle for absolute control, the Cold War, was already beginning. Chapter 9, The Iron Curtain, 1945–1953. In May 1945, the Soviet Union stood atop a mountain of corpses, having achieved a victory of biblical proportions. But for Joseph Stalin, victory was not a moment for relaxation, it was a logistical problem of consolidation. The Generalissimo did not see liberated nations, he saw a vacuum that had to be filled before the capitalist infection could take hold. Stalin's new empire was not built on the romantic ideals of revolution, but on the cold mechanics of Sovietization. Across Eastern Europe, in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, the script was identical. First, the front governments, then, the rigged elections, finally, the elimination of all non-communist opposition. The script held almost everywhere, with one defiant exception. Yugoslavia's Josip Broz Tito, a communist who had won power on his own, resisted Moscow's diktats and was excommunicated in 1948. In Prague, when the popular Czech foreign minister Jan Masaryk was found dead below his bathroom window in 1948, the message was clear: the map of Europe had been redrawn in blood and iron. Winston Churchill, the old lion of Britain, gave this new reality a name in a gymnasium in Fulton, Missouri: an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. From the Berlin blockade to the formation of NATO, Stalin accepted the Cold War not as a tragedy, but as a necessity. He had created a buffer zone of people's democracies, satellite states that served as both a shield for the motherland and a tribute to his personal power. The world was now a fortress, and Stalin was its master jailer. The terror returns. Yet, as his external empire expanded, Stalin's internal world began to shrink. The paranoid reflex that had defined the 1930s returned with a vengeful, senile intensity. He looked at the war heroes, the men who had actually defeated Hitler, and saw only rivals. The post-war terror began in 1949 with the Leningrad affair. The leadership of the city that had survived the most brutal siege in history was systematically arrested and executed, accused of treason simply for asserting their own prestige. But this was merely a prelude to the most sinister episode of his final years, the doctor's plot. In January 1953, the Soviet press erupted with a terrifying announcement. A group of 9 prominent doctors, most of them Jewish, were accused of being vipers and terrorist agents who had murdered high-ranking officials like Andrei Zhdanov and were plotting to poison Stalin himself. The accusations were entirely fabricated, a tool to channel public anxiety and Stalin's own anti-Semitism into a new wave of terror. For a man who had let his own son, Yakov, die in a German POW camp, accusing doctors of murder was a trivial fiction. To those who remembered 1937, the signals were unmistakable. Stalin was preparing the machinery for a vast new Great Purge. Rumors swirled of mass deportations of the Jewish population to the east and the systematic liquidation of the remaining old Bolsheviks in the Politburo. Fear, which had briefly been redirected toward the foreign invader, was once again turned inward. The hunter was back on the prowl, and everyone, from the humblest citizen to his closest lieutenants, felt like prey. The private tyrant. Behind the terrifying facade of the Generalissimo lived a frail, lonely old man. Stalin spent his final years almost entirely at his nearer dacha in Kontsevo, a fortified compound outside Moscow. Here, the most powerful man on earth lived a life of bizarre, claustrophobic ritual. Every night, his inner circle, Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and the ever-loyal Molotov, were summoned for dinner. These were not social gatherings, they were theaters of endurance. From 10 at night until 5 in the morning, these aging men were forced to consume vast quantities of Georgian wine and endure Stalin's capricious moods. They watched as he put on records of folk music or sat in his private cinema, mesmerized by American westerns and the films of John Wayne. The irony was profound. The architect of global communism spent his evenings captivated by the myths of the American frontier. Between films, he would force his subordinates to dance or tell jokes, watching them with those eyes of ice for any sign of hesitation or fatigue. A wrong word or a failed laugh could be a death sentence. When he was alone, he tended a small, walled garden where he grew lemons in the harsh Russian climate, a testament to his desire to bend even nature to his will. He was a man who trusted no one, not even his own shadow. He had his mail intercepted, his rooms swept for bugs, and his food tasted for poison. He was the master of 1/6 of the Earth's surface, yet he lived like a prisoner in a gilded cell. The silent dacha. By late February 1953, the atmosphere in Moscow was thick with the scent of an impending explosion. The doctor's plot was reaching its boiling point, the gallows were being prepared. On the night of February 28, Stalin hosted another of his marathon dinners. He was in high spirits, taunting his comrades and drinking heavily. Around 4 a.m., he dismissed them and retired to his private quarters. He gave his guards a strict order: he was not to be disturbed for any reason. March 1 dawned, then turned to afternoon. As evening fell, behind the heavy oak doors of Stalin's suite, there was only silence. The guards, trained for decades that to disobey Stalin was to die, stood paralyzed. They heard nothing. No footsteps, no coughing, no rustle of papers. The system of absolute fear that Stalin had spent 30 years perfecting had finally achieved its ultimate, ironic victory. The man who had purged the world of his enemies was now dying on his floor, likely from a massive stroke, and the very men he had terrified were too afraid to save him. Outside the door, the little corner was silent. The heart of stone was failing, and as the master of the empire lay helpless, the Soviet Union held its breath, suspended in the terrifying vacuum of his making. Chapter 10, The Death and the Ghost, 1953, present. March 5, 1953. At 9:50 p.m., the heart of stone finally stopped beating. When the news was broadcast across the 11 time zones of the Soviet Union, the nation fell into a state of paralyzed shock. In the streets of Moscow, millions wept, some out of a genuine, religious devotion to the Father of Nations, others out of a performative terror, fearing that the secret police were watching even their grief. But inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was not one of mourning, but of a feral, desperate scramble for survival. The vacuum left by Stalin was a chasm into which any of his subordinates could fall. A fragile, collective leadership emerged: Georgy Malenkov, the perceived heir, Nikita Khrushchev, the underestimated party secretary, and Lavrentiy Beria, the predatory chief of the secret police. These were men who had survived Stalin by being his most servile instruments, but now, the master was gone. The first to move was Beria, who immediately began reconsolidating his grip on the apparatus of terror. His rivals knew that under a new Beria-led autocracy, none of them would live to see the next year. In a rare moment of unity, Khrushchev and Malenkov orchestrated a palace coup in June 1953. Beria was arrested, branded a British spy, and executed in December. It was a classic Stalinist purge, used one last time to break the back of the very system Stalin had built. The first crack in the monolith had appeared. The secret speech, unraveling the myth. For 3 years, Stalin's ghost remained at the head of the table, his cult of personality still officially sacred. That changed on the night of February 25, 1956. At the closed session of the 20th Party Congress, Nikita Khrushchev took the podium and began a 4-hour address that would shatter the Soviet world. In what became known as the secret speech, Khrushchev did the unthinkable: he methodically dismantled the genius of Joseph Stalin. He detailed the torture used to extract false confessions during the Great Terror. He exposed Stalin's catastrophic military failures in 1941. And he read aloud Lenin's long-suppressed testament, which had called for Stalin's removal decades earlier. The silence in the hall was absolute. Some delegates reportedly fainted, others wept in shame. This was a breathtaking act of political jujitsu. By blaming the excesses of the past entirely on Stalin's cult of personality, Khrushchev absolved the Communist Party, and himself, of their own complicity. The speech's contents, though secret, soon trickled out, read at party meetings across the country. For millions of ordinary citizens, it was a dizzying, terrifying, and ultimately liberating moment, the official confirmation of the unspeakable horrors they had long suspected or endured in silence. The unraveling was swift. Across the Eastern Bloc, the speech acted as a slow-motion explosion, fueling uprisings in Poland and a full-scale revolution in Hungary. The de-Stalinization process reached its symbolic climax in 1961. Under the cover of darkness, Stalin's embalmed body was removed from the side of Lenin in the mausoleum on Red Square. He was reinterred by the Kremlin wall under a simple slab of stone. The man-god had been dethroned, physically demoted from the heights of socialist divinity to a mere mortal buried in the shadow of the state. The unquiet ghost, the legacy debate. Yet, Stalin could not be buried so easily. Decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, his ghost continues to haunt the global conscience. The debate over his life remains one of the most polarized in human history, a scale that refuses to level. On one side is the thesis of the builder and defender. Proponents of this view argue that Stalin inherited a backward, peasant nation and, through sheer, brutal will, forged it into an industrial giant. They credit his centralization of power as the only reason the USSR survived the Nazi onslaught. In this narrative, Stalin is the architect of victory, the man who turned a fractured land into a nuclear-armed superpower that commanded the world's respect. To his modern-day rehabilitators, the blood he spilled was the unfortunate, necessary fuel for an engine of national greatness. Opposing this is the thesis of the monstrous tyrant. For millions, the name Stalin is synonymous with an apocalyptic human cost. They point to a catastrophic death toll reliably estimated at 20 million souls, a number exceeding the total military and civilian deaths of World War I, lost to man-made famines, the Gulag system, and the state-sanctioned murder of the Great Terror. They argue that his paranoia nearly caused the USSR's defeat by decapitating the military on the eve of war, and that he built a system of lies and fear that stunted Russian society for generations. In this view, no amount of steel production or territorial expansion can ever justify the depth of the moral abyss he created. The central paradox of the 20th century is that both of these narratives are factually grounded. The builder and the destroyer were not two different men. They were the same man of steel. The modernization of Russia and the terrorization of its people were two sides of the same brutal coin. Final reflection, the heart of stone. We return to where we began, the dusty streets of Gori, Georgia, and the boy named So-So who sought to conquer the world that had tried to break him. Joseph Stalin's journey from a seminary student to the most feared Generalissimo in history is a study in the terrifying potential of the human will. He left behind a world shaped by his hand, a map of Eastern Europe that held for 40 years, a nuclear stalemate that defined the Cold War, and a Soviet state that eventually collapsed under the weight of the very rigidity he instilled. Stalin's ultimate legacy is a question that challenges the core of our historical judgment. Does the scale of a leader's concrete achievement ever justify the depth of human suffering inflicted to attain it? The ghost of Joseph Stalin still walks the halls of history, forcing us to decide, was he the maker of a modern empire, or the century's most prolific executioner? In the end, perhaps, he was both, the boy from Gori and the monster in the Kremlin, a final, chilling lesson in the absolute, and absolutely terrifying, price of unchecked power.
Thank you for watching this profound journey through history. The story of Joseph Stalin is one of the most consequential and chilling of the modern era. We'd love to hear from you. Please comment below, how did this biography make you feel? What other figures or periods in history would you like us to explore next? If you wish to understand the other half of history's most destructive duo, your journey can continue right now. Click the video on screen or check the description to watch our definitive biography of Adolf Hitler, exploring the parallel rise of the Nazi regime and the man who plunged the world into war. Don't forget to subscribe to EchoLib and hit the like button to support our channel and help others find this deep historical content.